gentlemen, please welcome your panel to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I add my own very warm welcome this afternoon. Thank you for coming to this debate. My name is John Arbuthnot. I'm the President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I also come from Largs. Why should I tell you that? Because today the citizens of Largs are celebrating the 750th anniversary of the Battle of Largs. Thank you. And I should have been there. And in these days, constitutional matters were settled in somewhat less organised and civilised way. Anyway, let's go on. The Royal Society of Edinburgh, along with the British Academy, in the autumn of last year, decided that we would mount a series of debates called Enlightening the Constitutional Debate. We've so far held 5 of these. This is the 6th event. I'll just rattle through the ones that we've already done. Scotland and the European Union, tax and spending, which was done at the British Academy headquarters in London, defence and international relations, the real economy, and then the last one, which was recently held in London, was banking, currency and financial services. So the two societies have then published in paper form, and the papers are at the back of this room. But what we're aiming to do at the end of the series is to produce an archive of this hugely important and serious series of issues as debated over the year. And I personally think that's a very important thing to do, because although the reporting in the media is very useful, tends to be a bit spotty, doesn't really have a long lifespan, and this should produce a comprehensive archive. The future debates are on the back of this little piece of paper, which I think is on your seat. If not, the next one is on the 25th of September on borders, immigration and citizenship. And after that, we are doing science and higher education. That will be in Aberdeen. On the 17th of October. The 20th of November is Welfare and Public Services in Glasgow at Strathclyde University, and the 26th of February is Historical, Legal and Constitutional Issues. We've also decided, because the British Academy debates are limited to a fixed number of people, that those issues of banking, taxation and currency will be repeated probably towards the end of January in a debate in Scotland. So that is what the societies are aiming to do. We do think it's extremely important. I think this afternoon we're going to be talking about culture and broadcasting and the extent to which, if Scotland becomes independent, that would substantially affect how these were organised, funded, presented, published in the media and by broadcasting. And of course, the whole broadcasting scene would be different, I presume. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our chairman, who will introduce the speakers, and I will sum up at the very end. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this latest event in the Festival of Politics. I'm Magnus Linklater, and our theme, as Sir John has said today, is culture and broadcasting. And on the platform here, you've got not only extensive but deep experience of both those areas. And I'm going to introduce them from my left. James Boyle, whose experience spans the border, and he spent his career at the BBC. He was head of BBC Radio Scotland. in the dim and distant times when Radio Scotland won the UK Radio Station of the Year award. As controller of Radio 4, he reformed the network, producing with his team an entirely new schedule, not without controversy, as I recall. Tried to move the Archers, I think, which is a tricky area. Since he's been back, chairman of the Scottish Arts Council, chairman of the Scottish Cultural Commission, and is currently chairman of the National Library of Scotland. And David Elstein, well, his broadcasting experience spans more than 40 years, both in BBC and ITV, where he's been director and producer, some of the most distinguished current affairs programmes of our time. He's been head of programming at Sky B, chief executive, Channel 5, and chairman and associated with a whole range of other broadcasting organisations. He also writes and speaks extensively on broadcasting, and above all, thinks a lot about broadcasting. So his contribution is going to be invaluable. And by the way, he asked me to draw your attention to the fact that he's not a doctor. So we've promoted him for the purposes of this afternoon, but it'll be withdrawn as soon as he leaves the room. Ruth Wishart is one of those people of whom one can genuinely say needs no introduction. I'm so terrified just looking at her. Needs no introduction from me. Only terrified because if I get one fact wrong, she's going to jump at me. Columnist, commentator, cultural ambassador, dare I say it, iconoclast as well. She's been assistant editor at a number of titles, notably on The Scotsman and The Herald. But for many years, she anchored the Scottish editions of Woman's Hour for Radio 4, in addition to presenting a whole range of daily and weekly programmes for Radio Scotland. And she's a board member of Creative Scotland, which is extremely important in terms of today's discussion, and chairs the Dewar Arts Award. And Brian Wilson, again, you will all be deeply familiar with. He is a trenchant commentator these days in the pages mainly of The Scotsman, where he holds forth without restraint on the current political scene. He is a former Labour MP, of course. He held 5 ministerial posts, but he was also the founding editor of the West Highland Free Press, lives in Lewis, and is the very successful chairman of Harris Tweed Hebrides. So that's a pretty decent range of experience, I think you'll agree, in terms of this afternoon's discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by asking each one just to talk for up to 10 minutes, give us their thoughts on this subject, and then we'll have a panel discussion and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I'm going to start with James Boyle.
Thank you. Thank you, Magnus, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to make just 2 substantive points, one about broadcasting and one about culture. I want to get to those points through a series of short steps. And starting with culture, I'd like to point you in the direction of the social stratification before I get to my principal point. Successive governments in this country have actually been quite good to the arts. The Labour Party the Labour government put in an extra 20 million at the time in the middle of the last decade, and the current government has encouraged the arts in very significant ways, both the performing arts and the national collections, and indeed protected the collections from the worst of the recession. The performance in that respect has been what one would wish, I think. Let me point you to something about the arts and just pick up the performing arts. We have 5 national companies, and if you go into the data, you find that In good times, they sell about 500,000 tickets a year, and in poorer times recently, it's been below that. It's been somewhere about 430,000 tickets. Look at the government data, and you know that, of course, those 500,000 or 430,000 aren't 430,000 people, they're tickets. And if you look at the data again and say how often do people go, and find how many go once, twice, 3 times, you get to a position where you can say maybe 2 to 3% of the population uses the higher end performing arts, the national companies, goes to hear them. Now, there's already a well-established link between higher education and use of the arts and age, and of course the other one we should add in now is wealth. A ticket is an expensive thing. So just to make the first point, at the upper end, what's been called the higher arts, we know that it's people who are pretty well educated, who are better off and who are older, who use those. And by and large, those arts in this country have been well taken care of by both sides. I think we need to look at culture a bit more broadly now and think about how the government, how we in fact define and look at culture. And if you look into our government statistics for culture, you will find that statistics include cinema going and reading, as well as of course, going to hear music, going to the drama and so forth. And in that number, if you add it all up, we're told that something like, I don't know, somewhere in the high 80s of people have some cultural experience. If you strip out cinema, which always puzzles me as an inclusion, and note television is not there. And television is one of the things, of course, where people see most drama, nor is radio there. But strip out cinema and you come quite quickly to a lower number. It's about 2/3. And in that 2/3 is reading. And if below that, you look at how we respond as a nation to our local authority services, who administer most of the arts. Most of the arts that people take part in are administered by local authorities, and that's where the big spend is. And there, we're told we really appreciate libraries. You can see it in all the government data. So you've got that sort of build-up of material there that takes me to say that if you now think of culture more broadly, culture and society, what difference would an independent state make? I'm kind of inclined to think that as a devolved power, both recent governments have done very well by culture that we've been talking about, the performing arts, the things in local authorities. But if we take one step down, something that obsesses me is that there is a big, big difference in society between those who will use the higher arts or ever hear music, classical music, and those at the bottom of the tree. That 66% who embrace the arts just doesn't tell you really what the life experience is. And I've had cause in the past to say that we really do need to think hard about preschool education and early primary and educate kids through the arts. It's a classic Herbert Reed kind of strategy, but education through arts is absolutely irrefutably the way to build confidence, the way to build performance, the way to build presentation skills. It's the right way to do things. It's also the way where you can engage earliest parents, grandparents, carers, and that's always a problem in our schools, and always has been, irrespective of the political party in power. What we do with that, of course, is build capacity. You build skills, but you build the capacity for youngsters to approach the arts with confidence later on. Is that rarefied? Is that otherworldly? Yeah, it is if you think of the cost. The cost of doing that would be quite enormous. We have a very, very well thought out curriculum for excellence. But as far as beginning early and getting to youngsters in the primary school, we still have the old model. We've got a brand new curriculum, but my experience right up to my grandchildren is that we've still got the same kind of operational model in preschool and primary, and we don't really want to turn around and say, how can we put resource into this to make sure not only that these children are educated for life and for citizenship, but they're also primed up as people who can live broader lives through the arts. Let me get now to culture and social class, and this is where my substantive point comes in. The government, the current government, I think, has been brave in saying that 20% of Scottish adults have a problem with literacy. Or to put it another way, are functionally illiterate. That is a colossal number. And it's a colossal drag on the economy as well as being a personal tragedy for each of those people. I don't think any of us would demur from the proposition that we have to stop producing illiterate children. And we have to go in there to think not only about the arts, but about their capacity to go to the library, to be readers, to appear in those top-line statistics. That seems to me something that any cultured nation would want to do. We have the power now in the devolved government to do that. I don't think we've got the resource at the moment. But a step has been made in identifying that problem. And let me point out that 20%, that average is an average. There are parts of our major cities, and I can give you this from first-hand experience, where the illiteracy rate is nearer 40%. Does it matter? I've done work in the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow because many people leave and just can't follow the medical instructions. It's a matter just of not knowing what your prescription says, not understanding the instructions, not having anybody at home who can read. So if I think about culture, I think more broadly about the social position. I think more broadly about the stratifications of society. And what I would say, first of all, is that it's a blight on our society to have that, because clearly it impedes not just your job ability, but your ability as a rounded person to go to the library, never mind go to hear the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. That's a cultural problem that we really have to identify. Any government's going to do that. We've got the power now to do it, and we should. Do we have the resources? That would need a proposition from government that you, the people, would assent to, because the money would have to come from somewhere else. Let me go quickly now and make my point about broadcasting. And I want to do it by focusing simply on my dilemma about the recent Broadcasting Commission report. And let me say, first of all, Blair Jenkins, who wrote that report, wrote it elegantly and as a man of integrity. I'm just at right angles to his conclusions, and that's what I want to talk about. First of all, the Commission doesn't recommend devolving broadcasting. That's not what it's saying. But inside it, there are two vectors that I find puzzling. One vector is the thought that we need more broadcasting about Scotland for Scotland, and that broadcasting should cost 75 million, be based here, and be accountable to government. And it's based on the model of a digital Scottish network, and there's quite fine detail about how much it would cost. The second vector is about creating product. It's about the opportunity that might give to create new higher value material and so forth, and stimulate the Scottish market. For me, there are two things inside that I'm skeptical about. The first is the number of times that the word accountable is used, and its close proximity to politicians. Irrespective of your political power, I am sceptical about politicians being near broadcasting. If I tell you that on one occasion, a minister of a previous government phoned me to object to a joke that was in a programme, and I had to say to him, Minister, do you think either of us could sustain it publicly if I had to say that I have to ask a government minister for permission to do a funny? Well, we had a hum-haw and we finished the conversation about that. But there is a detail in the way that people have been using political power over the last 30 years that worries me profoundly. And more than that, the situation since the 90s, when this climate of rebuttal to everything, aggravated rebuttal, this business of you say anything, the government comes back, that kind of thing isn't a healthy climate. In broadcasting, in the Broadcasting Commission report, the Broadcasting Commission asks for greater volume of high-quality programme, the development of opportunities for programme making and indeed risk-taking and linking with higher education. There isn't anything in that I disagree with. But I do disagree with the notion that a new television network based on the same old model about Scotland, for Scotland, is of much use to us. I don't think it's nearly ambitious enough. And I think that any government, whether it's a devolved government or a newly independent government, had better be trying to take the Scottish message outside. And that message really ought to involve technological brilliance. It ought to involve very, very high quality programs that can deliver us formats and IP, technological innovation that will allow us to possess source codes and sell them out, all of that kind of stuff. But not another television channel that simply offers us ourselves to ourselves based on the model of STV and BBC. I just don't see it. However, I do see the spend, the 75 millions. That 75 millions can either be spent on 4 hours broadcasting a day as it's proposed, and if I get this wrong, I'm sorry, but I think the average cost of the per hour is 30,000, which adds up to 75, including overheads, programme spend and overheads. 75 million for a television channel of outstanding quality. Radio 4, now, today, costs 122 millions. Radio, for quality radio. I don't think that 75 is going to buy us quality. But I tell you what, if I met Blair Jenkins here, I would say to him, yeah, go for the 75 from whatever source, but spend it in the way that the last government spent on Gaelic. Simply get it, get a small commissioning group, maybe it's already there in Channel 4 or something, it doesn't matter. But throw that money at talent and try to get the programs, the apps, the technological innovations, the games, whatever the people want to do that's in that creative patch, throw that money, but don't look for it just to be transmitted here. Try to sell it to Netflix. Try to get it onto the internet. Sell it to Channel 4. All of that stuff. Be more ambitious. But above all, and this is my point, my final point, the whole thing about broadcasting in Scotland is it's the same as every other Scottish industry. We're a small, medium enterprise country. What do we lack? We lack R&D. We've always lacked that in the various agencies. I think if you bring programmes to Scotland to assemble, it's roughly like assembling cars at Linwood. I think what we've got to do is use any money we have, and 75 million isn't actually a big number, to use it for R&D. Think of it as research and development and push it out to Scottish talent and let them come up with the answers and then worry about networks and where to put it. Give it to talent and let them go for it. And that's my final point. Okay.
Thank you very much, James. And now David Elstein.
Thank you very much, Magnus. Actually, although I've never even attempted to do a PhD, I did somehow manage to end up as a visiting professor at 3 universities, Oxford, Westminster, and our very own Stirling. So it's not for lack of academic rigour. Simply, I joined the BBC when I was 19, and that rather cut out the middle bit. I've no special knowledge of Scotland. I'm an occasional visitor, but I've never spent more than 2 consecutive nights here. And these days I just do day trips. I have no party affiliations or political connections. I have nothing useful to offer on the broad question of Scottish independence. But I do know something about broadcasting. And I'm certain that Scottish independence would profoundly affect 2 key pillars of the broadcasting economy: the allocation of spectrum and the structure and financing of the BBC. It's impossible to discuss broadcasting in the UK without the BBC being at the heart of the debate. The BBC's roots lie firmly in the 1920s, when public corporations were the fashion of the day and the empire was still a thriving institution. Indeed, the World Service, as we know it today, was launched as the Empire Service, funded by the licence fee, by that most famous son of the manse, John Reith. Reith was finally winkled out of the BBC in 1938 after 16 years at its head, and he fetched up as chairman of Imperial Airways, better known today as British Airways, courtesy of which I'm here today. The BBC, like the UK government, is run from London. Of course, it has elaborate regional and national structures with councils, boards and advisors, but you just need to follow the money to understand how the organisation works. The BBC's income, £3.6 billion from the licence fee, plus a further £1.5 billion gross and £150 million net from its commercial activities, is controlled from London, and the great bulk of the current costs are incurred in the shape of budgets for television and radio channels, all of which, with the tiny exception of BBC Alba, are run from London, national channels, I mean. Obviously, there are dozens of local and regional stations. Even when the chairman lives in Birmingham, or indeed Edinburgh, the vast majority of board meetings for the old BBC governors and the new BBC Trust were and are held in London. Like King Edward I in Wales, the BBC has built an impressive series of fortresses, Salford Quay, Pacific Quay, the Cardiff and Birmingham equivalents, costing hundreds of millions of pounds. But these are as much an expression of the BBC's power and how it exercises it as of any serious devolution of decision-making to the nations and regions. I gave evidence last month to the House of Lords Communications Committee, investigating how to measure media plurality. I argued that the BBC's 60% share, 60% of all news consumption by UK adults, needed to be mitigated by substantially devolving editorial decision-making within the organisation, separating authority as between radio and television, as between news and current affairs, as between network services and services in the nations and regions, and even allowing the BBC News Channel its editorial independence. My argument was that this would benefit the BBC, UK citizens, the degree of plurality in UK media, and democracy in its widest definition. What I did not emphasise to the Lords, I underline now, that a channel run by Scots for Scots and funded by Scots is, contrary to James's view, in my view, overwhelmingly overdue. It's almost become old-fashioned. But as part of that process of devolving editorial authority, and more importantly, as an expression of the Scots nation, what the Scottish Broadcasting Commission called the Scottish Digital Network has been on the agenda for some years, and it is a little stale at the edges, and it does need to be broadened out to deal more widely with the talent base in Scotland. But the concept has been stuck between the BBC's unwillingness to countenance it and the Scottish Parliament's understandable inability to fund it and ensure its place in our various broadcast systems. The Commission estimated the cost of the network at about £75 million a year. The BBC raises well over £300 million a year from Scottish homes through the compulsory licence fee, but returns far less than that in terms of programme budgets and commissions. £75 million to provide content targeted at 6 million Scots in Scotland and millions more outside, and with Scottish content, as James correctly says, then being made available on every other distribution channel worldwide, not just Netflix. That compares favourably with the £95 million a year cost of the Welsh language channel S4C, serving 500,000 Welsh speakers, which the licence fee will be funding from next year. Could the Scottish Parliament pick up the bill for a Scottish network? It already spends nearly £12 million a year on BBC Alba, virtually the entire cost of the channel, serving just 50,000 Gaelic speakers. And for Scottish licence fee payers, it would be adding injury to insult if they had to pay an extra £12.50 on top of the licence fee to provide a service that should be funded by the licence fee. Moreover, under current laws, the Scottish Parliament does not control broadcasting spectrum in Scotland, so could not impose a Scottish channel on a fully stretched transmission system. Providing access solely online is a very unattractive and expensive alternative. James referred briefly to STV. My view, STV does a reasonable job for Scottish viewers, but it has too little practical independence from the ITV network to do significantly more, certainly nothing on this scale. And meanwhile, the coalition in Westminster has preempted a protected and precious slot on our various electronic programme guides to carry the local TV services that Jeremy Hunt was so keen to see launched throughout the UK, making it almost impossible for a Scottish channel to find a space on the EPG. So how does Scotland escape from this triple bind? The first objective should be to demand from the Westminster government the right to preempt the spectrum and EPG placing secured for local TV services for a dedicated Scottish channel or whatever else a Scottish Parliament chooses to devote it to. Making that demand ahead of the 2014 referendum serves a useful purpose. Westminster might deem it politic to concede the point before it became a referendum issue. And if Westminster refuses, a referendum issue is what it should and would become. The second objective is to confront the BBC. We should never forget that S4C was conceded by a Conservative government in response to a hunger strike by the Welsh nationalist leader Gwynfor Evans. Now, I'm not suggesting that Alex Salmond or his waistline needs to adopt the same tactic. However, attacking the soft underbelly of the BBC surely makes sense. The coalition ambush of the BBC in October 2010 was a salutary event. In a brief 48 hours, the BBC conceded that it would finance out of the licence fee the BBC World Service, a Foreign Office project, S4C, a Treasury project, broadband rollout, an industrial project, and local TV, a Jeremy Hunt project. The collective cost of these commitments, none of them a legitimate charge on licence fee payers, is close to £400 million a year. And the BBC opted for this hefty burden to avoid the alternative, that is, having imposed on it the cost of providing free TV licences for the over 75s, some £600 million a year. That was the axe that was waiting to fall on them. 2015 will be the year when the BBC faces a wide range of pressures over its scale and scope, its governance and its financing, as the renewal of its Royal Charter looms closer. So the next 12 months should be the year in which the Scottish Government asks the BBC whether it really wants to risk the full potential impact of independence, loss of £300 million of licence fee for a start, or would rather reach a concordat ahead of voting day that would take broadcasting substantially off the referendum agenda. That concordat would concede not just the financing of a revamped version of the Scottish Digital Network from 2016 onwards, but detailed editorial independence for BBC News and Current Affairs departments in Scotland from 2015. The BBC is in many ways a wonderful organisation, but its structure, its design, its history, its DNA and its mindset render it resistant to real change, let alone constitutional upheaval. But like many seemingly powerful institutions, it's also vulnerable to a carefully planned attack. Ofcom, the UK media regulator, is already putting pressure on the BBC Trust to find ways to offset its dominant place as a news provider by extending internal plurality. Granting far greater independence to BBC Scotland is one way to meet that demand. The bigger step, a fully independent Scottish network funded by the licence fee, needs to be built above this and can be delivered by a determined campaign launched from this building. Beyond that, of course, is the prospect of a fully independent Scottish broadcasting system if the referendum result allows it. And indeed, why not? The law, education, health, why not broadcasting? But that prospect should also be used as a lever to deliver stages 1 and 2 of the Scottish broadcasting agenda as I've described them, even if that negotiation involves leaving unharvested some of the fruits of independence should it be voted through. I'm a great believer in the bird in hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And now Ruth Wishart.
Thank you, Magnus. I was sitting in the book festival the other afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, at an event which paid a handsome and very well-deserved tribute to the late Gavin Wallace, who'd headed up the literature portfolio at Creative Scotland, and before that, of course, at the Scottish Arts Council. And one of the contributors at that event noted that 30 years ago, a critic took it upon himself to review every year Scotland's new publications over the previous 12 months. And he noted too that this would now be a quite impossible task, such has been the explosion of new and confident voices. And that's true. And what a rich literary seam we've mined in those intervening years. And what a diversity of the talent. Ian Rankin, Val McDermid and Denise Minor following in the wake of William McIlvanney's trilogy with elegantly written crime novels. And one of the better news from this week at the Book Festival was that all of William McIlvanney's canon is being republished. James Robertson and L. Kennedy bringing their sharp intellects to bear on the socially vital issues and conditions of the day. Carl Duffy and Liz Lockhead simultaneously occupying the Poet Laureate and Macar's chairs. Chris Brookmeyer, Chris Dolan, Janice Galloway and the much-mourned Ian Banks. Young, vibrant newcomers like Jenny Fagan, just named in Granta's 20 under 40 Best Young Authors this year on the strength of her first novel, and also shortlisted for the James Tate Black Award, which will be awarded tonight. And our playwrights too are operating at the top of their game. David Gregg and David Harrow are just two whose new works are being premiered at the Traverse Theatre of New Writing this week, this festival. And I want to give you an example of, I'd like to give you an example, but I've slightly misplaced my notes here. So let me just say that I wanted to mention the spoken and the written words particularly because in Scotland, as we enter this period of vital debate that we've been talking about and a period of vital contemplation about the future across all the art forms, it's, I think, from the ranks of our writers and performers that some of the most thoughtful contributions have already come. There's a group of young visual arts and digital professionals who set up the National Collective website, which is an open forum, as many of you will know, for Scotland's creatives to foster reflective and constructive debate, as does their colleague on Bella Caledonia. And these have proved quite important platforms in a world where the print media seems too often still dominated by tribal war horses, whose mission seems more about wounding a perceived political enemy than taking a judicious look at the most attractive option for our country. In his TV series and accompanying book, Ian McWhirter, the journalist and writer, made the point that in the run-up to the '79 referendum, sometimes the creative voices, the musical voices, proved to be well ahead of the politicians in tuning into the zeitgeist. There was a period in that time, and I'm chronologically gifted enough to remember it, when bands like the Proclaimers had the confidence to sing in their native accents, and where bands on the East Coast of America were trying very hard to perfect that accent. Well, I think we're at something of a similar point now, ladies and gentlemen. Scotland's creative community is alive with comment and debate and passionate flightings, whilst professional politicians sometimes seem unable to shed the sometimes stifling garment of party loyalty. I want to give you one example for this week, and it comes from a politician, a very accomplished and experienced politician for whom I've got a lot of respect. But she took to the public prints to denounce the now infamous description of settlers and colonists ascribed by the novelist and artist Alistair Gray to anyone from Firth of Scotland who came here to run one of our cultural institutions. She wrote, "When we begin to question people's legitimacy on the basis of origin, it leads to some very puzzling and often troubling attitudes. But the truth is, this is nationalism in the raw. And she added, no matter how you try to cut it, no matter how many of the rough edges its advocates try to smooth over, nationalism will always have at its core the belief that the solutions to all our problems can be found within our borders. Now, I want to compare and contrast that conclusion with that of the many people in the cultural community in Scotland who also responded to Alistair's original essays and his performance more recently at the Book Festival. Because almost with one voice they paid respect to his body of work, but begged to differ with his views on this issue. Our writers, our musicians, our performers know that importing not just people but influences from all over the world nourishes, enriches and inspires our own native traditions. When Celtic Connections began just over 10 years ago, it was a relatively modest affair, celebrating the best in Scots and Gaelic traditional music. Now it's a glorious festival of interconnected traditions from absolutely every part of the globe. Because no matter how you cut it, to paraphrase the politician, internationalism will always have at its core the belief that Scotland's identity and traditions can only benefit from an infusion of the exciting and the exotic. But you know, the building block of that internationalism is a self-confidence born of the pride and the knowledge about your own cultural traditions. In my view, that confidence grew exponentially when somewhat belatedly we thought it might be quite a good idea if our children learned in school about their own history and their own literature. That self-confidence, I think, is everywhere evident in the early years of the 21st century, from the burgeoning fashion movement to the cutting edge and design innovation of the gaming industry. And I've got no difficulty with people from elsewhere, from out of our shores, running our arts institutions, with one important caveat. They have to have the right credentials, self-evidently. They have to have the right motivation, and crucially, they have to have the right attitude. When Vicky Featherstone was appointed as the first director of our shiny new National Theatre of Scotland, she encountered a great deal of scepticism. Her theatre without walls, however, has reinvigorated parts of Scotland more traditional models had allowed to wither on the vine of geographical indifference. She commissioned some of our best young writers, and when she left, having presided over the international triumphs of plays like Black Watch, her valedictory speech emphasised the importance of respecting and understanding the culture in which you come to work. Now, not all of the people appointed originally to the new arts funding body Creative Scotland understood that imperative. And when they got it wrong, it was the artistic community which lost no time in telling them. But the newly appointed director has spent her first 6 weeks getting to know her staff, getting to know as many creatives as she can in that short period, and she's declared that the needs and the aspirations of artists have to be the foundation and the ethos of everything Creative Scotland does from here on in. I believe that strikes exactly the right tone. Janet Archer is not from Scotland. But let's not forget that this is a two-way street. We export cultural talent all over the world, from the fashion and design houses of Italy to New York's theatreland. It's called cross-fertilisation, and it's an entirely healthy phenomenon. I want to say something very briefly about David Elstein and James Boyle's contribution on a dedicated Scottish digital network, because I'm amused and bemused that the gentleman from England thinks it's a very good idea and the gentleman from Scotland thinks perhaps we shouldn't bother. But I think the Broadcasting Commission got it broadly right when they suggested, as part of their main recommendations, there should be a digital dedicated channel for Scotland. I think this is a kind of direct descendant, ladies and gentlemen, of what we went through in a pre-digital limited platform age, when there was an unanswerable case for having a Scottish Six, which would be a main news bulletin, which wouldn't be parochial in content, but which would look at national and indeed international events through the prism of a Scottish perspective. I think perhaps a digital channel could do that for this age, and in relative terms, as we've heard, in terms of the licence fee money going from Scotland to London, it's not a big ask. The arguments for going down that route, I think, are much the same as they were in the days of that Scottish Six argument. When devolution first arrived in Scotland, BBC correspondents travelling to the dark side of the moon, which is what Scotland sometimes seems to people who live in the central London bubble, they were hastily given a new book of guidelines. And these explained that health and education and housing and transport were all, like the legal system, subject to different arrangements. As a result, today, listeners to the Today programme know that the most often used phrase is now "in England" or in England and Wales when the item has no locus and arguably is of little interest north of the border. But the insistent question, I think, at this and other forums is what difference a yes or no vote would make to the creative and cultural health of our nation. To be absolutely honest, I think the current vibrancy across all Scottish art forms would continue without significant damage if Scotland proves too fearful to do what seems the natural thing for most other small nations, to grasp the opportunity to run their own affairs and determine their own priorities. I'm not by instinct or inclination a party political animal, but I am convinced that this is a golden opportunity to say yes to building and nurturing a set of values which will bear no relation to the mean-spirited civic divisiveness currently being visited on the UK by Ian Duncan Smith and his colleagues. I think we can do better. I think we owe it to our children to do better. And I think this philosophical divide is very evident in the way in which culture is viewed on either side of the border. The Westminster Culture Minister, Maria Miller, in an unhappy echo of the Thatcherian 80s, recently reiterated that the arts, like everything else, had to pay their way and demonstrate their capacity to be economically productive. In contrast, the Scottish Culture Secretary, Fiona Hislop, used her recent Talbot Rice lecture to emphasise her belief that the arts' most important function was to enable and to inspire. So I'll sign up to that. And so too will Scotland's creative community, and so too would England's creative community given the option. Some people have suggested that it's selfish to ignore the plight of our English neighbours, battered right and left by the forces of cultural darkness and 30% budget cuts. And I think that's a false analysis. It's not selfish to try and build a consensus around a quite different set of communitarian values and offer that to our good friends and neighbours as a better model of government. Neither is it selfish to want to protect the vulnerable from the iniquities of the so-called welfare reforms in the way that we've managed to hold sort of a line over health and education. And I want to end in education because James Boyle touched on it. Michael Gove has persuaded himself that revisiting some supposed golden age where every child could recite their 9 times table while simultaneously declining Latin verbs in copperplate handwriting is the way ahead. But here in Scotland, with the Curriculum for Excellence, we've got a model which has survived 2 quite different Holyrood administrations of different political hues and which puts creativity firmly at the heart of all teaching and all learning. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that's no more than enlightened self-interest in a world which needs school and university leavers to be of independent mind, to be collaborative, to be inquiring, to be curious. This time last summer, I sat with several thousand other people in a field in Stirling. It was wet. It was stair rods wet. We were, as they say in these parts, absolutely drooked. We were also absolutely entranced as a small children who 12 months before had never even touched a musical instrument were playing with the Simon Bolivar Orchestra. This year they did so again in Venezuela, where the notion of liberation and education through music, known as El Sistema, had its birth. Now a second tranche of children will be given the same life chances through music in the south side of Glasgow. That's the kind of visionary thinking I want to see applied throughout our cultural policy in Scotland. Our children, our young folk, learning that the sky is the limit no matter where you're born and no matter in what circumstances. Because if we know anything, ladies and gentlemen, we know that talent is not a postcode lottery, but too often opportunity is. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And now Brian Wilson.
Well, thanks very much, Magnus. David's disavowal of his doctorate, it reminded me of a story of when I became a Labour MP in the same day. Quite a few of us did, and we arrived in the House of Commons, and there's in the central lobby there's the kind of quoted attendance, and one of my new colleagues who had a doctorate in a not terribly important sociological subject told these guys that he wished henceforth to be known as Doctor when they called him. So another of my new colleagues, Sam Galbraith, who was a very distinguished neurosurgeon, was passing. So the attendant said, I just wondered, we won't mention the other guy, said he wishes to not be known as Doctor. Is it the same with you? And Sam says, no, he says, I'm too senior for that. So David, you're too senior. I think in this debate, and I haven't written a thing, I just thought I'd try to, since I was speaking last, I thought I'd try to pick up on some of the themes. But I think all the onus of proof in this debate, and everything I've heard confirms this, is those who want to separate. I don't use that in a pejorative way, but it is literally, it's political separation into two separate states, two different states, call it what you want. Because we know what we have. We know what we have, and everyone seems very proud of what we have and thinks that we're doing not too badly on all of these fronts, but they want to change all that. They want to change it. And when you look at what we have just now, and I think it's ironic maybe of all events, the Edinburgh International Festival, this wonderful international cultural event that we're on the fringes of the fringes of here, which over a period of more than 60 years has grown, developed, flourished, brought all these hundreds of thousands of people that we struggled through to get here today, and it has done that completely without inhibition from the constitutional or political status of Scotland. So what is there to change? Our national galleries, our national companies, our theatres, they've all developed under the system of the Union, not because of the Union, arguably, certainly not entirely because of the Union, certainly be part of Scottish, as expressions of Scottish identity, but they certainly haven't been inhibited by the constitutional status quo, whether in its pre-devolution or its post-devolution form. They're there for all of us to say they're the products of the period in which that union has prevailed. The hundreds, the countless artists that Ruth is saving the trouble of some of the current ones by listing all of these names, the hinterland of writers, of painters, of musicians, of composers, all of these have plied their trades and developed their talents under the existing constitutional arrangements. So again, there has been no inhibition. Now, it may be argued by people who are on the other side of the political divide for me that there would still be no constitutional inhibition and somehow 100,000 more flowers would flourish. But there's absolutely no a priori evidence of it, whereas there is a great deal of a priori evidence of what we have and what has developed in these 300 years of union. Take some of the other examples that have been alluded to. Both I heard a similar discussion on radio this morning with Jim Naughty. The current ones in Scotland, the VA in Dundee, nothing has stopped that happen. Elstein, fabulous development, right, which I know a wee bit about how it arose and so on, but totally in line with my principles, not as a nationalist, but as a socialist, of extending opportunity to every child to develop their talents to the best of their ability. The difference is I want to extend these opportunities not just to children in Stirling and the Raploch or in Govan Hill. I'm just as keen to extend them to children in Liverpool and Newcastle and Corby and Manchester. Celtic connections, again, 20 years of it, but 20 years which have straddled two different forms of unionism, one pre-devolution and the other post-devolution. No inhibition from the constitutional or political situation that exists. So someone has to prove, in order to make an argument in this, that the existing arrangements have inhibited what we have culturally in Scotland, and that somehow what is an offer to us is going to make things better. And in order to do that, they have to not only deal with the status quo, but they also have to deal with the benefits which cross-border, cross-cultural, cross-current relationships have contributed to what we have in Scotland, and equally what, under these arrangements, we have contributed to the rest of the UK, to the rest of the world. And again, there has been no constitutional or political inhibition on that. But if there are things wrong in Scotland, whose fault is it? All of the powers relating to the arts are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. When 100 leading Scottish artists of various kinds wrote a letter last year complaining about the way things were being run, they weren't complaining about London or Westminster or the Union or Brussels or anywhere else. They were complaining about Creative Scotland, appointed in Scotland, run in Scotland with a budget from the Scottish Government. So why don't we just do things better here before we worry about the Constitution as a kind of alibi for anything that is wrong? And I couldn't agree more with James Boyle about literacy. Literacy rates are appalling. Go to Barlinnie Prison. 70% of people in Barlinnie Prison are functionally illiterate. It's a large part of why they're in Barlinnie Prison. But you'll never change that by changing the Constitution. You'll change it by changing priorities, putting money into early intervention in schools, which is what I tried to do as education minister, and which to a very large extent has currently been done. If you want to change the opportunities of people, then it's through social and economic policies. It's not by trying to pretend that everything changes by changing the constitution. Let me go into broadcasting. And I really think that the idea of breaking up the BBC, and I want to come to some of David's points in a minute, is an act of wanton vandalism, not just for the BBC, but also for Scotland and what Scotland has access to and is part of at the present time. If you wanted an example of an institution which has benefited from scale, in which Scots have played a disproportionate part and continue to play that disproportionate part, then you'd look to the BBC. And this is where I want to just, not to disagree with David, because I agreed with a lot of what he said, but to make a distinction here. We're not talking about amending the status quo, David. You know, if what Ruth wants, and people like in her camp want, is we're not going to be part of the BBC. Now, you can look for leverage over the next year for as long as you like, but if you get a different answer in the referendum, then we are no longer part of Britain and we are no longer part of the BBC. It is an absolute. It's not a matter of degree. Now, I'm with James, actually. If I had 75 million pounds to spend on broadcasting in Scotland, I too would invest in excellence and talent and aspiration. I wouldn't broadcast in 75 million pounds of people talking in Scotland to Scotland. But that's a detail of the argument. The principle of the argument is that if we do opt for creating separate states within the small island of Britain, then we are no longer part of the BBC. And as you rightly said, you take away 10% of the BBC's revenue, and you take away a great deal of what it can do of the things that are heavily, heavily subsidised compared to audiences. But you also turn us into a nation of eavesdroppers, because we'll still watch the BBC, we'll still listen to the BBC, but we'll no longer be part of the BBC. And of course it will, because we have created a foreign state on the other side of the border, it will work to the agenda of its own state, not to our state. Do we really want that? Or do we want access and to be part of and to share in the ownership and to contribute to the excellence of Radio 4, the excellence of a world service, the excellence of all the other things that the BBC does so well and so uniquely in the world? And what will be offered in exchange? Well, we've heard a lot about digital networks, we might or might not. The only other alternative that's been offered is RTE. We've got RTE, it's called STV. And a broadcaster based mainly on imports, mainly on cheap programming because it doesn't have the money, and funded largely by advertising. Why would we want that as a Scottish broadcasting authority instead of our share in the BBC as it is? And I finish on this point. There's plenty I'd be critical about the BBC about. I'd like to have a debate about how BBC Scotland uses its money, what it prioritises and so on. The problem for so long in Scotland is you cannot have these debates on the basis of rational argument or different priorities or anything else, because they're obfuscated by everything being fed into the constitutional debate. So you either defend the BBC on the basis of a political constitution, or you oppose the BBC and say you want a Scottish BBC on the basis of the constitutional debate, instead of having the substantial argument about content, about priorities, about policies. And that's the same difficulty in so many aspects of Scottish life, but 30 years of talking about nothing but the Constitution has taken away the substance of politics, the substance of debate, and turned everything into a debate of seeing things through the prism of the national question and the Constitution. And we've got to get away from that. And that's the way, when you get back to real politics, when you get back to social and economic policies, that's when you transform people's prospects, their opportunities, and you make Scotland a better place. Thank you.
Well, I think you can see where the divide lies. That could hardly have been more clearly spelt out. So I think we'll stick with that theme. And just remember, this is about culture and broadcasting. And just before we plunge into the politics of it, I'd just like the thought which I'd like to put to most of the panelists, if they're interested in arguing this case. does broadcasting have an obligation to culture, or does it simply have an obligation to entertainment? What is that obligation? Does it lie in within the BBC's guidelines, or is it just a sort of general cultural view that a broadcasting station ought to be fulfilling a duty to culture, to the culture of a particular nation? Because that, after all, is the umbrella under which this whole debate is taking place. David, do you have a view about that?
Well, this is an argument that goes back 90 years. When spectrum was a scarce resource, because most of it was required by the Ministry of Defence, and we hadn't developed satellite transmissions, digital transmissions, etc. There was a very straightforward trade-off. You got a piece of spectrum if you did public benefit programming in addition to entertainment. So it's a bit like planning gain. You allow someone to build a block of flats provided they provide a swimming pool for the locality. And the BBC's deal was, and it was Ruth who invented it, was to inform and to educate and to entertain. When Lord Beveridge came to pass verdict on the BBC in 1949, he thought it had accidentally inverted that to entertain, inform and educate was a long way down the bottom. Ruth personally hated the third programme. He thought it was a waste of money. So the definition of what planning gain you look to, is it documentaries, is it arts programmes, is it children's programmes, is it religion, is it very high cost regional and local programming because it's not spread in terms of its costs across the whole network. All that adds up to the deal over spectrum. ITV has, over the last 15 years, abandoned most of its commitments to public benefit on the grounds that the spectrum that it's been allocated is worth less and less. They are willing to spend roughly £100 million a year out of their £1 billion budget on stuff that otherwise doesn't cut its, doesn't return its cost. Channel 4, publicly owned, allocated spectrum worth £600 million a year, spends the vast majority of its income on entertainment and acquisitions, and a small part on public benefit programming. So yes, broadcasters who are given privileges are required to give something back. Bizarrely, most of the arts programs I watch are on Sky Arts. For whatever reason, they have decided that it's excellent branding, and given that they spend £1 billion a year on marketing, the 25 million they spend on arts is peanuts. But boy, spread across 2 whole channels, it looks really impressive. And compared with what the BBC currently does in the arts outside the prom season, which is a fantastic event, it looks fairly impressive. But my concern here is not with whether broadcasting owes a duty to culture, or indeed culture owes a duty to broadcasting. I see broadcasting as part of culture anyway. But my concern here is a mild Sassenach wonderment at everyone's caution and anxiety. I can't see the people of Denmark or Norway voting to abandon their broadcasting systems in order to be part of the BBC. They have wonderful broadcasting systems with far less money to spend than £300 million a year, I should say. The drama output from Dance Radio or from a Norwegian television vastly exceeds the drama output from STV and BBC Scotland combined. There's a kind of a nervousness here, which is you either have to, as Brian is implying, give up the BBC completely if you're going down the independence route, or take your part in the BBC hierarchy of things and be a satrapy.
Right.
Well, I don't think that's the choice.
Let's just pick that point up with James. I mean, there is some force in that argument. After all, if you look at the cultural output, you talked a lot about high culture and the importance of instilling it into the education system. If you look at the output of that kind of culture in a Scottish context on either BBC or STV, it's pretty poor. It's pretty minimal, to be honest. Here is an opportunity to put some of the things that Ruth has been talking about, the writers, she talks about a great cultural upsurge. None of that is reflected at the moment. Isn't this the opportunity, to, as David so eloquently points out, to unleash all that?
Which opportunity? The new channel,
Well,
proposed channel.
A new channel, yes.
Well,
A proper spend inside Scotland.
Well, at that spending rate of what I think comes down to 45 to 50 millions actually in programming for the channel, I don't think you get anywhere near that, because the principal points that are put to you in the Scottish Broadcasting Commission's report are about news and current affairs, the thing we don't need more of. Ofcom statistics tell you that since 2007, the drop in current affairs broadcasting in England has been about 28%. It increased in both BBC and STV by 6% in the same period. And one of the things to remember is that the opt-out system in BBC Scotland has given us both our current affairs and current affairs from London, which often is very difficult to schedule because of the yawn factor. And that brings you back to mixed programming and what do you do if you're a network controller and you want to schedule. Of course, in a mixed programming service, you need both the basis of its authority, the news, but you do need material which is entertaining on that spectrum from blind date to the proms. You've got to be able to take all of that in. The thing is, everyone has an obligation to diversity in programmes to serve the whole audience. Fragmented channels mean that fewer and fewer young people move away from anything but the popular music channels on the far end of the spectrum, and that's a pity. But the thing that Ruth was talking about, and that I hope I was talking about, was that somewhere at the beginning in education, you have to give people the appetite for that. And we've got all the resource and all the talent we need in Scotland to be able to do that and precipitate it from the education system into broadcasting, which is a part of the economy as well as culture. But if you're going to do that, you have to fund it properly. And to fund that properly, I think you need to get as much money as you can into the creation of new programs, new apps, new code sources and all the rest of it. And that means leaving behind old-fashioned models that guys my age have thought up and going to where youngsters are and where the new economy is leading us, whether we're independent or not. Get the IP, get the source codes, get all of the things, and that means invest large amounts of money, take the risks, rather than set up same old thing, same old thing.
Ruth, Brian was sort of turning your argument rather against you and saying...
Never.
Yes, he was. What the various things that you were alluding to, Celtic Connections, Systema in Raploch and that kind of thing, he said, look, these are all happening within the existing system. So can you explain what the sort of cultural add-on would be of launching a Scottish digital network? What is not being done? What are we being deprived of, as it were, on the cultural front by our current broadcasting system?
Quite a lot, really, because it's almost, if you look at the scheduling at the moment, there's very little discrete broadcasting of Scottish cultural material. You get maybe 40 minutes of Celtic Connections in January is broadcast on the BBC. I also would take issue with the thought that, I mean, Brian's painting a picture where the world is watching some marvellous BBC programming and we're all sitting at home with an animated version of the McFlannels, and it's not like that, because of course it's not a new digital channel is not instead of the BBC programming. We all have access to, hundreds of channels now. We'll all continue to have access to hundreds of channels unless the man from the ministry stops smashing up the Guardian computers and takes to set-top boxes instead. I mean, these are false choices that are being made. But a specific channel, for instance, when BBC Alba came along, for a very small but important number of people speak Gaelic in Scotland, but nevertheless a lot of money was poured into that as a deliberate act of political will by BBC Scotland, as a result of which one of the few well-funded documentary strands that we have in Scotland at the moment is Yorpa, which is a very good Gaelic programme, but it's not mainstream broadcasting, pardon me, and it's not reflecting mainstream culture with the money, with the political will, and with a separate channel. I think you could address some of the things that we don't have, some of these lacks.
And Brian, if we just for a moment just stick to radio, it is the case at the moment that within this system that you are saying is producing a highly satisfactory sort of spread of programming, on Radio Scotland, we actually have a very low standard of cultural output. I don't think that's being too rude. I could be much ruder about it. And Radio 4 produces some Scottish programmes, some excellent Scottish programmes. But in terms of the balance, in terms of what I presume Radio Scotland is our national broadcasting station, that is a very feeble output.
Well, it goes back to my last point, Magnus. I mean, I would actually share your view. I mean, I'm not a defender of Radio Scotland, but I'm not. I should be able to make that argument in a broadcasting context rather than in a constitutional context. I mean, Radio Scotland isn't what it is because of the Constitution. It's because of policy decisions that are made. That is how that is the kind of programming it should operate. But what I certainly wouldn't want to lose would be as you rightly say, and I was listening to some of them this morning as we travelled down. What I certainly wouldn't want to lose is the Scottish input into Radio 4, which is very substantial and is excellent. And it is partly because there is the resource base in Radio 4 to do it. But you could. It's not an economic argument. It's not a financial argument or a constitutional argument that there's so little serious speech-based programming on Radio Scotland. That is a domestic Scottish decision and a domestic Scottish issue, which personally I think that there could and should be far more documentary material, far more serious discussion, talks, all the rest of it on Radio Scotland.
Where's the substantial Scottish input into Radio 4? Would you like to give us a bit more flesh on that?
Yeah, well, I was listening last night to a serialisation of a book about Bill Shankly using Scottish actors. I was listening this morning to Jim Naughtie talking about roughly the same stuff
that we're here for the festival.
We're talking about today. You've been advertised as a presenter of Women's Hour when it came from Scotland.
10 years ago, they got rid of that.
I hear a lot of Scottish programming, and every bit of that Scottish programming is going to the whole of the United Kingdom and the wider world.
Ruth, I beg to differ with your point. I think there is some really good Scottish stuff on Radio 4. But my point is not that, and whether it's enough or good enough. It's that it's being done from London on Radio 4. Surely it should be done up here by Radio Scotland. If it's worth doing, why aren't we doing it? I mean, that actually is a point for James.
Yeah, well, I mean, it remakes my point. Brian's absolutely right. The decision to fund Radio Scotland belongs in Scotland. In its present state is entirely a Scottish responsibility. If we wanted to do anything on what is actually an old-fashioned concept, a mixed programme radio station, we should do something about Radio Scotland and restore it to its strength. And if you want to restore it to its strength, you need the twin engines of news, authoritative news, and entertaining narratives like drama and so forth. And I don't agree that everything on something like Radio 4 has to be identifiably Scottish. I used to commission the very best science-based drama I've personally have heard in my career from Edinburgh, and it didn't come on with a skirl of the pipes. It wasn't identifiably Scottish, it was just brilliant. And it related to our USP in Scotland, which are thinking and science. And I would much rather, if we're going to do something about Radio Scotland. I would much rather we went in there and made a decision to buy high value programming for that network, fund it to high value program, and above all give it narrative back, because it doesn't have sustained narrative anymore, and that means it's very difficult to hold your audience over the longer period.
Now, I sort of heard there's a very characteristic sort of low hum from a Scottish audience which greets certain points, and I sensed that people had wished to sort of respond to some of the points. So what I'm going to do is to say that if anybody has a question at either at this point or at a later point that they'd like to ask, or a point they'd like to follow up, please put your hand up, and we'll then get the microphone. Do we have a microphone? We've got a microphone, just the one microphone? Well, what we'll do is we'll take 3 questions together, and then we'll discuss those 3 points. So we've got one to start off with here, one halfway down, and then one at the back, at the front here.
Thank you, Ruth, for mentioning the proclaimers and their Scots accent. I'd like to ask the panel whether they think that Scottish language has a place in Scottish culture, and whether the way that Scottish language has been neglected has any effect on the illiteracy in certain parts of the country, where people don't feel that their own language and culture are valued.
Right. Next, halfway up.
My name's David Brew. I just wanted to ask the panel, whose discussions I found very stimulating and interesting, about the consumption of cultural output and the means of consuming cultural output. Because James was quite right that all of the decisions on prioritisation of spending, whether it comes from the taxpayer or from the BBC licence fee, are based on a set of statistics where reading a book is regarded as a cultural benefit and watching a television programme is not, except in the context of assessing what the BBC is doing. And in our whole approach to what is valued, what the Scottish Government thinks is positive by way of improving the cultural well-being of the country, we count the number of people that go to theatres to consume or watch drama productions, but we don't count the number of people that watch those same productions on the iPlayer or on a traditionally broadcast channel. And it's interesting to me that Gaelic TV in Scotland, BBC Alapa, which costs a matter of about 15 million by comparison with the over 100 million for Welsh TV, Welsh language TV, has a much higher audience penetration in Scotland than Welsh TV does in Wales, and has higher audience viewing figures because all of the non-Gaelic speakers watch music and football. There's a whole other issue about whether football is culture or not, but I won't get into that. But the question in a nutshell that I have is, are we right to regard cultural output that's consumed through the medium of television and radio as a lesser value, as having a lesser value than the collective experience of going to theatre, music, festivals, whatever?
Thank you. And we'll take one more right at the back there.
Can I endorse Ruth's comment about the fact that our English contributors seem to make the boldest, bravest, most positive contribution in regard to the heading of the debate? However, I'd just like to ask a question in regard to the BBC's performance. I attended a seminar recently where Tom Devine said that based on his knowledge of many people within the BBC, that many of them are extremely unhappy with the BBC Scotland's performance. And I think somebody suggested, a couple of speakers suggested it was within the remit of the BBC in Scotland to fix Scotland's problems. I'm not sure that's true given the cuts to the budget. But finally, I'd just like to ask you to respond to the fact that the BBC Scotland Trust report, their own research suggested that nearly half of the Scottish population was dissatisfied with BBC Scotland's output. And even worse than that, the epitome of their wonderful annual performance report was Mrs. Brown and her boys. Now, if that is the BBC satisfying Scottish culture, Mr. Wilson, you and I are on a different planet.
Right. I think what would be we might just pick up this point very quickly, and actually, Brian, because you are in Gaelic-speaking territory, do you think that the Scots language itself is somewhat neglected when you look at the overall output? Is there an obligation on a broadcasting organisation to ensure that a language thrives, or is that simply something that government has to try and fund?
No, if I can just widen the point slightly, because I agree with the principle of the point. But again, what I think is in education that localism, regional, is ignored to a far too great extent. I mean, it greatly is one of my big issues. That kids in the Highlands and Islands, for instance, places where I've lived most of my life, that they leave school without knowing anything about the history that created the environment in which they live. It's probably true in industrial areas too. They don't know their own history. My son went through, he did his Hires this year. He got taught about the Scottish Wars of Independence. I'd much rather that he was taught about the Lewis land struggle that created the environment in which he lives now. And there's choices in that. And when on the language, in the Scots language thing, I am totally in favour. I think kids who grow up in Buchan, where in any part of Scotland, where there is dialect, where there is richness of language, that richness of language should be taught in exactly the same way as Gaelic is taught, and taught through Gaelic. What I would be concerned about with the Scots language thing is, and I can see this coming down the track, is that again it is taken away from its local environment, and it's made into it's not about the language or the culture, but it's turned into a political issue, exactly as happened where now you have in Northern Ireland you have to have balance of treatment between Ulster Scots and the Irish language, and to a large extent Ulster Scots is an invented language in order to create that balance. So when I see a question in the census, do you speak Scots? And I reckon 1 million, 2 million are going to say it, as opposed to 50,000 Gaelic speakers. Do I speak Scots because I use Scots words every hour of every day? No, I don't speak Scots. I speak English, but I speak it with a Scottish flavour. It's a different thing. And issues of language are very, 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 very sensitive of whether they become actually about the substance of what you're trying to achieve, or whether it becomes about a political point. On try to stick with that one.
Ruth
Okay.
wanted to say something quickly about it.
Well, yes, as quickly as I can, Magnus. It's just I'm intrigued by Brian's response there, because he would rather properly his son learned about Hebridean history rather than kind of pan-Scottish history, but doesn't have any problem with my knowing more about the Corn Laws than I do about the Covenanters, because when I went to school, Scottish history wasn't taught there. I mean, so it's an odd point. But just quickly on the language thing, I think lots of money got put into Gaelic for a variety of reasons that needn't detain us. The same amount of money hasn't been plumbed into Scots, but we're partly to blame for this because we're Scottish, all kinds of Scots language societies fought with each other as the best way to go about it. But we have slightly got an act together now. There is a lot of educational material available in Scots now, and there's an absolutely wonderful publishing house called Itchy Coo Publishers, which not only does stories in Scots, but translates people like Roald Dahl and various other children's storytellers into the Scots language. I think that's very fruitful.
Brian, I'm actually going to ask David Elstein if you just pick up this second point about the consumption of culture, and about whether it is justified to look at sort of television culture, so to speak, as of a lower order than the kind of culture that James was talking about.
Well, television, sad to say, offers an awful lot of rather low quality content these days, and I would say probably half of what the BBC offers is not worth bothering with. But the other important truth here is that broadcasting is a fantastic means of distributing culture. It's the best we know. You know, the BBC built its reputation on turning the English into a musical nation by broadcasting music. And people learned about music for the first time in the 30s and 40s and 50s because they had access to the BBC. And the puzzle for me is this. I spent many a night as a current affairs producer working with an exiled Scots reporter who regaled me with Rabbie Burns night after night. And for me, it turned into a kind of music. After a while, the language, which mostly I couldn't understand, had its own rhythms and, as I say, musicality, and it was wonderful to listen to. I recently watched an RTE drama production in English called Love Hate, on, of all things, Channel 5. It was wonderful to listen to because it was English, but a Dublin English, very distinctive, rich, and, you know, woke you up thinking, Now, Scotland's got this fantastic ability to be itself and to be a communicable language. Scots English is a fantastic asset for Scotland, but you need to make vastly much more of it. You know, I watched Fields of Blood, which was the BBC's nod towards Scottish drama in Festival Week, tucked away at the end of July. And in order to get it onto network, Andrea Calderwood obviously had to bring in some English actress to make sure that the controller of BBC One was willing to broadcast it. But it was great to hear a lot of really strong Scots accents in a drama driven out of Scotland. It wasn't actually a very good drama, but so be it. And it enriched my experience as an English person in terms of what we can learn. Now, you know, when I look at what £300 million could buy you in terms of new content creation, properly packaged and presented, boldly Scottish, defiantly, proudly Scottish, and how much difference that would make to the external perception of Scotland around the world, and not just in England, where I live. When I ran the Sky's programming for some years, I would love to have had a Scottish channel. You know, it would be great. I mean, I think Sky probably spends more on employment in Scotland than the BBC does because it runs its customer services out of Scotland. But it's a great way of using broadcasting to transmit and enrich and nourish culture. Should be the other way around: nourish, enrich, transmit. But it's a process which we thoroughly underestimate, and people who kind of draw a distinction between how many people listen to the Scottish Chamber Orchestra and how many people watched, I don't know, Northern Ireland had a great drama last month or 2 months ago called The Fall, which 3 or 4 million people watched. Brilliant piece of production, rather repellent, but superbly cast, brilliantly written, directed by some guy from Belgium. I mean, extraordinary that we had an English writer, a Welsh producer, a Flemish director doing a drama in Northern Ireland, which was not about the Troubles at all, and was a fantastic representation of. I've been to Belfast many times, more sadly than I've been to Edinburgh, and it was great. That's what broadcasting can bring you. When the BBC originally said Nation shall speak unto nation. Scotland is a nation. Let it speak.
And now we need to pick up the angry gentleman at the back and reflecting, I think, a lot of people's views. And it's a challenge, it's a genuine challenge to both James and to Brian, who are making the case that the present system is perfectly adequate for our needs. Hang on, I'll just finish that sentence. Or rather, that within it, it has the potential to meet Scottish needs, and it clearly is not. So what is going to happen in terms of its funding, or in terms of the cultural drive that's going to produce the kind of programming that's going to satisfy the gentleman at the back? Brian.
Well, he finished about Mrs. Brown's Boys. Now, I like Mrs. Brown's Boys. You know, millions of people watch Mrs. Brown's Boys, and it's made in Glasgow. It gives a lot of. It doesn't come out of BBC Scotland's budget. It responds to exactly what was asked for, was to transfer more UK-wide programme making to Glasgow. It could have been anything. It happened to be that, and some other programmes that are now run out of Glasgow. It gives employment to people. It expands the range of programmes that are coming out of there. It's not pretending to be a Scottish programme or an icon of Scottish culture, but you only want to produce icons of Scottish culture. I mean, it's two entirely different arguments. Do you resent Mrs. Brown's Boys being made in Glasgow? It seems to me to be standing the argument in its head that, you know, that it would be okay if it was made in London or if it was made in Dublin, which is maybe the more obvious place, but because it's made in Glasgow, this is somehow, you know, beneath the dignity of BBC Scotland and against the kind of cultural ethos that you wish to set. I want to see all sorts of things made in Scotland, and as James Boyle said right at the outset, I particularly want to speak outwards to the world about Scotland. And that's where, you know, £300 million or £75 million, whatever figure is plucked from. Well, £300 million is the licence fee. That's not what you're not going to make £300 million unless you're going to suspend all other broadcasting. That's not what you're going to make the programmes. You're actually not talking about choices here. You go back to James Boyle's point. If you've got that £75 million, concentrate on excellence and speaking out to the world. That seems to me to be a better idea. But Mrs. Brown's Boys is a diversion, and what the BBC did, again, I'm not going to be pushing the corner, Magnus have been a defender of it, but what they did was respond to the choice that more network programming should be made from other parts of the UK. So you end up with Mrs. Brown's Boys, and instead of someone saying, that's great, there's a couple of hundred people getting getting work out of a programme that gives millions of people entertainment. Instead of saying that, you look down your nose and say, what a disgrace that Mrs. Brown's Boys been made in Glasgow.
No, sorry, Mike, I must just point out, because that's to miss the point. I think when Pacific Key came on stream in Glasgow, its shiny new BBC Scotland headquarters, people thought, we all wanted 200 people to have jobs making programmes, but we kind of thought in a naive way they might be making programmes in Scotland rather than importing or pre-existing network programmes and branding them, you know, putting a brass plate on them at Pacific Key, because that's what's happening. We didn't expect Pacific Key to mean Anne Robinson and Waterloo Road, and I like Waterloo Road. I'm not being at all sneery or snobby about it, but I would quite like that wonderful facility to have been used for the purpose of expanding Indigenous drama, so that these same 200 people would be making programmes here rather than being tacked on to the end of pre-existing programmes.
The two aren't mutually exclusive, obviously.
Well, they seem to be a bit.
One isn't happening. The part of what Ruth has just been describing is not happening.
But there's not enough drama being made in Scotland. I'd agree with that.
James?
Well, I thought I'd made it clear when I was speaking that I don't think the present situation is satisfactory, and therefore I don't want to extend it with the same old model. There's lots wrong that we can criticise about BBC Scotland and STV. The idea that Mrs. Brown's Boys is the triumph of the year is absurd, and I thought I made the point when I said if you're simply going to assemble other people's programmes, you're building Linwood. You're not getting any value from the creative activity at all. So I think that should be said clearly and loudly. You certainly do need to improve what's here, but not through extending that system. The other thing about the culture on television is one of the prime things that we've failed to do as a nation is we've failed to introduce the rest of Scotland to the Edinburgh Festival. The Proms is sitting right on top of it in scheduling terms. Nobody, including me, has ever succeeded in getting the Edinburgh Festival, music, drama and so forth, the agreements, the IP, the money to do it, out to the Scottish public, and that is a disgrace. And I feel ashamed that I've been part of the generation that failed that.
But just to extend, I mean, David, as I understand it, is making the argument that to use this potential new digital channel would give Scotland the opportunity to do many of the things that it's not doing at the moment. You are saying, let's use that money, admittedly not enough, but a start possibly, to promote our own culture, to get artists working, etc. Why is that not being done at present, and what is it within the system that's holding that back?
I think it's a sclerotic, old-fashioned system, and that's why I say don't extend it. The BBC, the numbers, that David was talking about, why do we take numbers for people going to see drama, live drama and so forth? Well, we need that for return on investment. We can identify the public sum. We want to see what value for money we get. But actually, as I said, if you go down to do the sums and see that it's 2, 3, 4% of the whole population, is that return on investment? Well, it's almost inevitable, but if you want to make a change in it, you've got to do something more than just bolster the present system. If we do take BBC Alba, and I don't think the Scottish Broadcasting Commission said that was necessarily the answer, but BBC Alba's numbers are undoubtedly because of footy. I mean, that's just there, and it's a fact. It's there because of footy. You put on extra footy in Scotland, you can clear the streets. You know, that's just the way it is in this country.
You just can't understand the commentary.
that's right. But
now,
sorry.
Any more questions from the audience? We'll take 3. There's one here at the front, one halfway up, and one near the back. So could we start with the one at the front, please?
First of all, I'd like to say, Mr. Elstein, you seem to have more vision than some of the Scots in terms of broadcasting. Would you like to try and put your enthusiasm and vision into practice? Do you see a potential role in making it happen? And secondly, coming from... I'm not asking you to tout yourself around, but you obviously have the experience and the vision.
We'll give him a doctorate as well.
Yes. And coming from down south, you probably don't see the debate in the same detail as we do day in, day out. But are you aware of the huge hill that has to be climbed by those who would like to see this nation governed for ourselves and not as part of a larger failing state? Are you aware of the dreadful propaganda that I'm not saying politicians here. Independence is more than about the SNP. It's about the people. The SNP are just the means of delivery. And more importantly, it's what we do with that independence once we get it. Because I don't want to see the sort of the Blairite policies of the current SNP administration, which reaches for the legislative book to solve all sorts of minor ills. They should be a bit more imaginative than that. So it's what we do with our independence, what we want to see going after the big day, hopefully. And I would okay, I'll try and be brief. Are you aware of the propaganda that
let's stick with the propaganda point. That's a very valid point to pick up on, rather than getting involved in a major political argument, which we'd be delighted to do it on another occasion. Right, and one at the back. One just here.
Hi, I think the guy who's just been talking has been listening too much to King Alexander the Fish. But my question is more about what actually is culture. I mean, born in Glasgow, I went through the city of culture phase. And I am actually a little bit confused that we don't include a lot of folk culture in our thinking. One of Scotland's greatest exports is digitisation based on beautifully crafted artistic models which create the backgrounds of game shows. And we are influencing perceptions around the world. And can we include some of that thinking, which has been, again, completely and totally independent of any concept of constitution? Can we expand our idea of culture beyond a potential elitism that we might be going into here? That's my point. What is culture?
Right, well, we'll leave the big questions to the last, I'm glad to see. And one towards the back there.
Thanks very much. There's points being made about use of local language and dialect by the lady at the front, and Brian mentioned localism. But the direction of travel in this country seems to be against that. We've lost Grampian TV as a distinct channel, which I very much regret. And David's talking about potential loss of local spectrum for a Scottish channel. I would say, is this no a centralist viewpoint? How about fostering local channels instead, so we have genuine devolution of opportunity, such as Ruth was advocating, so there's no a postcode lottery of opportunity, and opportunity to create creative communities like BBC Alba all across the country. I mean, I'm an Arcadian. I would love to see an Arcadian TV channel, so long as I didn't slag off the council, since I'm the council leader there.
Well, that's a very important point, which we need to address. But let's just ask, we'll have a yes or no from David. Are you going to come back and run this channel for us?
That wasn't my intention. There was a...
It wasn't a job application.
No, 33 years ago, a brilliant Scottish broadcaster, Jeremy Isaacs, gave a lecture just across the road in memory of another brilliant Scottish broadcaster, Jimmy McTaggart, which was widely known as the Jeremy Isaacs job application lecture, because he described how he would run Channel 4, and lo and behold, 2 years later, he was appointed to run Channel 4 and made a superb job of it. I mean, this is the interesting thing, that Scotland has generated some superb broadcasting talent. I mean, apart from John Logie Baird inventing the television, you know, we've had people like Stuart Hood, Alistair Milne. I mean, it's James, terrific. I learned literally so much from Jeremy Isaacs about what it was to make a current affairs program, how to shape a narrative, how to create drama out of what's going on around you. And what I see here is it's just an opportunity for Scots people to grasp, not for some English carpetbagger to turn up. I'd be delighted, on behalf of the Scottish Parliament, to sit down and negotiate the deal with the BBC that would deliver real value to the people of Scotland, because I know how to do that. But I'll leave it to others to run it.
Brown, but just picking up, but also would you pick up on the point that I think was being made by the gentleman there about, I think he used the word propaganda.
He seems to be more of an expert in it than I am, but I want to take that. I want to take that up. I don't really understand David's logic here. Is it not better, David, that Jeremy Isaacs and James McTaggart and Alistair Milne, that their talents as broadcasters were to the benefit of broadcasting in the UK and beyond?
Absolutely.
And that well, in that case, why would they stay in Scotland to run a Scottish television channel? And if they did, they didn't. Well, they didn't. Alistair Milne was the controller of BBC Scotland. All of them went to the bigger stage. All of them went to the bigger stage. True. Absolutely true. And is that good? Is that good? Is that good or bad?
Rob Woodward has come back from helping to run Channel 4 to run STV. There's plenty of traffic the other way as well, Brian.
Yeah, of course there is. That's a great thing. That's a great thing.
It should be both ways.
Yeah.
You know, brilliantly talented people from Scotland
Exactly, yeah.
should make their way in the world. You know, Andrew Carnegie made his way in the new world. It's not just at Westminster or in Broadcasting House in London that they need to make their way. But equally, talented Scots have stuff to give back to Scotland as a whole.
Yeah, but we know
and
that.
and
That's what happens.
and
That's what
should
happens all the
and
time.
it will happen. It will
Could
continue
I
to happen.
interrupt the point just for a minute, because there is a problem here, not about talented Scots going to work elsewhere, because the world is peopled with talented Scots who went forth and multiplied their opportunities, and that's absolutely grand. But what's happened now is that the South East and BBC in London are so overheated and have taken unto themselves so much power in decision making that people are not deciding, I'd like to go to a bigger stage. People have got no choice but to go to that bigger stage, whether it's Westminster or whether it's BBC in London. And we have to create the opportunities here so that some of our talented people will say, I want to stay here and build something here, not that I have to go somewhere else in order to fulfil my potential and my aspirations.
Well, can I just do the local point?
Yeah.
Do the local point as well. Well, I come back to that if you want. Well, but the idea that people have been driven out, people leave because they want to broaden their experience, and many of these, well, of course they do, and many of these people will come back at some stage of their career, and others won't. But the fact that you have the fact that the BBC, we're talking specifically at the BBC, has been the avenue for a fantastic number of broadcasters to contribute to the benefit of broadcasting and the quality of broadcasting, not just in Scotland, but the whole of the UK. Is it not wonderful that two boys from Barra are among the best broadcasters in the UK just now, both broadcasting to the UK and to the world through the World Service, the Buchanans? Is that not fantastic? Would it be better that they were in a Scottish broadcasting service? And they never achieved the experience that comes from being part of bigger and wider.
It's not an either-or choice. You know, you're making it sound as if
but you're making
it's
it an
one
either
or the other.
But
No, absolutely not.
No. That goes back to the argument about whether you're using the next year for leverage or whether you are supporting the objective, which is to create a separate Scottish Broadcasting Corporation, which would not be part of the BBC.
I haven't committed to that at all. What I've
I'm
said
glad to
is
hear that. Yeah, I think
you've got the leverage
Yeah.
in the next 12 months to extract from the BBC substantial concessions, financial and editorial, to make a really strong fist of Scots broadcasting, which is simply not possible under the current structure. And the BBC responds to pressure. We all know the BBC responds to pressure. You know, 75 million is trivial within the, you know, they lost £100 million on an IT thing that went wrong. You know, not a penny to be seen of value of that. You know, they spend 65 million disposing of unnecessary managers, a third of whom they then rehired. I mean, what goes on inside the BBC is terrible value for money for all of us. You know, we all feel it. And if I were a Scot, knowing I was subsidising the BBC out of my licence fee and getting so little in return, I'd feel even more aggrieved. But there is an opportunity here, and you should not let it pass.
Right. I want to get to the regional point, but James, you've got 1.5 minutes to answer the question, what is culture?
I want that 1.5 minutes. I can answer what is culture easily. It's walking into Radio 4 on day one and saying, good morning, I'm from Glasgow and I'm your new controller. Because that accent was really difficult. Let me tell you about, however, David's point. With great respect, David, I've heard you many times, and breaking up the BBC is always one of your strongest points for the audience. I would say to the people that are applauding that, do be careful what you wish for. There is every reason now, forget constitutional change, there is every reason now for us to be determined to make the BBC better and to make BBC Scotland much, much better, but not at the price of breaking the whole thing up. My point about bringing money into the system is about saying we want high quality from Scotland. That's the essential thing. And we want to expand what we do on the basis of our brains and our creative talent. And these things aren't necessarily administrative change. These are about determination, ambition and vision.
And now just let's pick up the Orkney point, because Orkney and Shetland are just one part of the Scotland, just may not be entirely happy to stay part of this constitutional arrangement. And so we'd better give them really good broadcasting. Ruth, how do you do that, and why is it not? Why has the BBC retreated from that to an extent with, or STV? We better include them both in terms of the decline of regional television.
I'm all in favour of restoring that, the concept of localism, but I would just enter one caveat. Sometimes I get, and it's not just about local television, it's about national television as well. Sometimes instead of celebrating what's unique and all of the indigenous talent in a location, we get a stream of crime stories and a stream of low-level crime stories and murders and whatever else. So when we get to that stage, we have to make sure that the prospectus is sufficiently visionary and ambitious to make it worthwhile.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've actually reached our deadline. Absolutely bang on, Sir John. As you can see, arising out of this discussion are some critical points, not just for this particular debate on culture and broadcasting, but I would argue for Scotland in general as we embark on this, what's coming up to our final year of debate leading up to the referendum next year. And while we've focused hitherto on matters such as constitutional issues, Europe, the economy, defence, etc., I would argue that culture has got to be right at the heart of it, and the improvement of our broadcasting service, which I think, I now realise everybody on the panel believes there is huge room for improvement. How it's achieved, they may differ on, but there's no question that we need a better broadcasting service in Scotland. So that has emerged from this discussion, and I'd like you just, before asking Sir John to sum up, to thank our four panellists.
Well, I'd like to firstly thank the panel for their contributions this afternoon to what has been a really lively and, from my point of view, an extremely useful debate. I'd like to start with Magnus's last point, which is this is part of a whole sequence, as I said at the beginning, of debates about the really key issues in the approach to the referendum. And I would also add that what we have done today is not something that is going to disappear as soon as this programme, this meeting finishes. We will record and we will publish the summary of the meeting on our website. And I guess I should have said this at the beginning, but you've all been filmed and recorded. And there will actually be an edited version of what's happened as a film on the website as well. So this will persist and it will sit there along with the other major topics, and it will hopefully add to the richness of the debate, which I think is the function of what the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the British Academy should do. It's been a very lively debate. I'm not going to try and summarise all of that, but some things stood out particularly for me. One was the initial discussion about literacy and the really startling, not to me, startling statistics about the degree of illiteracy, particularly in the Glasgow conurbation. For a period of 5 years, I was chairman of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. One of our greatest challenges was to communicate with our citizens. For us to send a brown envelope to most of the homes in the East End of Glasgow was of no positive benefit whatsoever. They wouldn't even open the envelope, they would simply tear it up because they couldn't read it. And that situation, to discuss what we're talking about at the higher end of culture and communication and broadcasting with that background, is something we should think about as a nation. The second thing was the issue of culture itself. I think the question, what is culture, is a very good question. I think we dealt with some aspects of that. I think there are obviously parts of the cultural movement in Scotland which are really, really exceptionally good and thriving. We heard, but not a lot, about our the great success of our writing population in terms of books and plays, of our musical population. We then switched more to broadcasting, and that was much more controversial. But I don't think we should forget about the standing and the standard and the international impact that the pinnacle of our cultural ability and potential in Scotland is actually achieving, not just in Scotland, but beyond. When it comes to the broadcasting, I'm not going to repeat all the debates which were going on in that, but I do think that, and this is something else that I've had to deal with in relation to the future of integration of health and social care in Scotland, we have to become more aware of the importance of localism. It's not to say that localism should dominate the way that we think, because there have to be national policies. But I think we are moving to realise that local communities, and you mentioned the islands, and I did actually have to look at the health situation in the islands at an earlier stage, and they have different priorities. So we must be more aware of localism, both in communications and broadcasting and so on, but also in the delivery of our social services and in the vibrancy of our political activities. So lots here to digest, lots to be very thankful for in relation to the debate that we've heard. Somebody mentioned eavesdropping. When Ellen and I were we spent 14 years in Ireland between 1975 and 1988. RTE was quite rigorous in trying to prevent people from actually listening to BBC transmissions. Do any of you here remember a programme called The Thornbirds? Thornbirds was a programme, quite salacious programme about the activities of a young priest. There was nobody on the east side of Ireland who did not watch that programme on BBC. Yeah, the level of interest that we generate in our programmes mustn't be underestimated. Thank you all for a great afternoon.